right, how was dinner? Is it okay? All right. I thought it was very good as well. Desserts are still, I think the desserts are all down. Coffee is being served. There will be a little bit of noise as the remaining plates and stuff are removed. I hope that you don't mind if I try to speak over that. Our guest tonight is John Stossel. He's a very unusual guy because he is not a liberal, and yet he is a journalist. That makes him part of the 1%, I think, of the media these days. Now, most of us are familiar with surveys that have been done of journalists over the years, and they typically show that 80% or even 90% of journalists surveyed say that they self-identify as liberals or Democrats. During the election, the last presidential election, something on the order of 80% or 90% said that they had voted for Barack Obama. And the expression "in bed for," what was it, "in bed for Barack?" In the tank for Barack Obama, I think really made it clear that the media had decided to take sides in that presidential election. Media bias, which might have been a little more subtle in the past, I think became really apparent just over the last few years. The ideology of a working journalist shouldn't be of any concern to us so long as the journalist follows the general code of ethics for journalism. It's not hard to find. There's an organization called the Society of Professional Journalists. You go to their website, they've got a code of ethics. The code of ethics, I printed it out. You should test the accuracy of information before you publish it. You should seek out the subjects of news stories to give them the opportunity to respond to allegations of wrongdoing. Make certain that headlines, news, teases, and promotional material do not misrepresent. They should not oversimplify. And finally, journalists should support the open exchange of views, even views they find repugnant. I don't think that describes very many journalists these days. Some of you who have paid attention notice that the Heartland Institute has been the subject of some really negative publicity over the last couple of months. It's just shameful. And for 28 years, I've worked with journalists. I recognize bias. I know that they're not always fair, but they've usually been pretty professional. Over the course of the last 2 or 3 months, I haven't met a professional journalist yet. I really haven't. We haven't gotten a fair shake in any interview that we've done with the mainstream media. The only good news is what's happening online. And as the mainstream media gradually disappears, we're getting a whole new generation of journalists and reporters working online who I think are a lot more interested in the truth and accuracy and all these other things that appear in that code of ethics. So there is hope. And there is hope because we have guys like John Stossel. Now, John started out on the more liberal end as well. Some of you know he was a consumer reporter, and he discovered, like many reporters do, that bashing corporations and exaggerating public health problems was a great way to get a good story, to get good numbers and to move up in the journalism pecking rank. He got 19 Emmy Awards. He was honored 5 times for excellence in consumer reporting by the National Press Club. But in his, I guess his second book, John, I don't know what your first book was titled.
Give Me a Break.
No, that was your second book, John, right? You had a book before this. What was that one?
The second book was Lies, Myths, and Downright Stupidity.
So I'm missing a book. All right, so this was his first book, Give Me a Break. A great book, a great overview of free market perspectives, and it tells the story of what it's like to be a liberal journalist and then to discover that the stories that you're reporting are actually wrong, not factual based, pandering to the lowest instincts of your audience, and then his move to a more fact-based approach, which resulted in no longer getting any of those awards that he had gotten when he was on the left. John's new book, No They Can't, is now out. Excellent book. I'm about a third of the way through it. Really well done. A little less biographical and a little more issue-oriented this time. And he compares what people imagine or instinctively feel with what the real facts are. I noticed that he quotes Friedrich Hayek twice in the introduction. Anybody who quotes Friedrich Hayek is a friend of mine and a friend of everybody in this room. So it's a very thoughtful book. I think it shows John is actually growing up as a thinker and a journalist. He's spoken for us before, I think, at one of our global warming conferences in New York in 2008, and before that at an annual benefit way back in 1994. It's always a delight to have him around. John, thank you for joining us, and please welcome John Stossel.
Thank you, Joe. It's good to be back here. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I spent most of my childhood in Monroe Harbor, which I think is in that direction, sailing a little boat. So it's nice to be back here, even though I like New York much better. The booze will continue. Joe is wrong. I am a liberal. I am a classical liberal. I think government should leave people alone and adults should be free to do what they want to do. That's what the word liberal used to mean before American socialists stole it and called themselves liberals. Also, in this code of ethics that you were listing, you're not supposed to oversimplify. I work in television. I oversimplify all the time, just to get people to pay attention. But so now I have this new book. My goal is to join Rachel Maddow on the bestseller list. So please buy copies for all your friends, and maybe some of them will learn something. If it's on the list, more people get these ideas. And I have once I woke up and changed the focus of my reporting. Joe mentioned it made me stop winning Emmy Awards, but my goal now is just to get these ideas out because they are better for people. They help people be free and prosperous, and yet people don't get it. And hence, when politicians say, yes, we can, hence the title, that's why people believe that. I mean, President Obama, the people said his election would end poverty. And the yet-to-be president himself said at one point, my election will bring us to the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and the planet began to heal. This was his global warming answer. But now at least people don't have the same magical faith in him. And polls suggest that people are dissatisfied with government. Congress has, what, a 12% approval rating? Yet, what I argue here is that the instinct when we're scared or when we want a solution will be to turn to government. It's just human. What's what we do. I do it sometimes. You see a problem, you say, there ought to be a law. Well, a law is government force. Politicians take that and say, yes, we can. And we get the big government we have now. So one example, 9/11. It made us scared. I assume it made me more scared than you. I live in Manhattan. Afterward, the Congress said, we got to take over the airport security. It had been run, you may remember, by the government, but they hired private contractors, and they paid people low wages. And they obeyed all the rules. The little knives that the hijackers brought on board were within the government's rules, but the government afterwards said, they didn't do a good enough job, the government has to take it over. Tom Daschle, the Senate Majority Leader, said, you can't professionalize if you don't federalize. You laugh, but this makes sense to people, and the Senate voted 100-0 to create the TSA. So how's that working out for us? Now we can make fun of the TSA and our bad experiences with them, but you might think that, it's necessary. They have kept us safe. But we don't know that. I mean, maybe they did something. It's all secret. The two instances we do know about, the shoe bomber and the underwear bomber, they totally went through the TSA. They were stopped by passengers, not the government. And there's one airport that doesn't have the TSA, San Francisco. In the law, it said if a city wants to opt out, it can opt out, and San Francisco did. And so we interviewed people at that airport, and they said things like, gee, these screeners are friendlier. This is different. And the lines move quickly. And the TSA, the government, did its own undercover survey of airports, and maybe they were looking to catch the private screeners there doing a lousy job, but surprise, they found they were more likely to find contraband. So why is this? Why are the private screeners more likely to find contraband quicker and friendlier? Because they're private screeners. Because their boss knows that if they do a good job, he'll get hired again, he might get rich. And if he does a lousy job, he might get fired. The TSA knows you can't fire the government. They have no incentive to innovate, to be better. This private contractor, how does he make his screeners better? He runs contests. He calls them March Madness contests. He gives you $1,000 if you're the best at zipping through the luggage and finding the hidden pipe bomb, they plant it, and then repacking the bag for the people you don't find the pipe bomb in, well, quickly. And they reward people who are courteous. And they test people and find the ones who are best at remembering and seeing things, and they make them personnel identifiers. They innovate because their own money is on the line. Private does it better, but that's not intuitive to people. Private seems selfish. Intuitive is central planning, because life's complex. You have lives. You don't want to pay attention to all this stuff. I have trouble getting my brain around how you build a sewage treatment plant myself. I don't know how. I want to leave that to the experts in Springfield or Washington, D.C. And so it's natural to say, let's get the smartest people in the room and we'll make them the planners of the economy. It just feels right to people. Where does this come from? Well, maybe from our own history. I mean, when we were little children, our parents ran our lives, and that felt safe and good. Our ancestors, for thousands of years, lived in groups of 100 or 300 people, a tribe, and if you didn't follow the tribal leader's central planning, you probably died if you didn't harvest the fruit at the right time. You didn't give birth to us. So we're trained to follow the leader, to follow the planner. We're not trained to imagine that in a world of 7 billion people that an invisible hand could do it better. Or, as Hayek put it, a spontaneous order. It's just not intuitive. I mean, a skating rink isn't intuitive. What if a skating rink had never been invented? And I told you, I'm a greedy businessman, and I'm going to invent this business where I'll put ice on the ground, I'll charge people money, and they'll zip around on it on sharp blades. And young and old and all kinds of people, and there just won't be any rules. You'd say, no, there have to be rules. There has to be a cop, has to be left turn, right turn, stoplight, some regulation of that. But you laugh only because you know skating rinks, you know that they work. But if you hadn't seen one, you would resist that. And this is why people say, well, government has to do things. Government has to run education. Government has to run healthcare. People say, yeah, your beloved free market works for simple stuff, music, movies, cell phones. But education, the customer doesn't understand it. The parent doesn't know what the curriculum should be. They don't know what their kids should learn. In healthcare, when you're having a heart attack, you're not on the way to the hospital going to do a consumer survey of which doctor is most likely to treat you well or at what cost. So for the big stuff, you got to have government in charge. And that intuitively makes sense to people. But that's wrong too, because you don't have to be an expert for the free market to work. As one example, consider cars. Do you understand why one car works better than another or safer than another? I sure don't. I'm no automotive engineer. But compare the worst you can buy here in Chicago with the best the planned economies the central planners could produce. That was this. Remember it? For you younger people, this was the pride of the Soviet bloc. I mean, this was designed by East Germans. They were rocket scientists. And yet the Trabant was the best they could do. It's an awful car. There's a guy in Indiana who's got 6. I've driven them. They're just hard to shift, hard to drive. They smoke. You have to put the oil and gas in separately and shake the car to mix them together. And yet there were waiting lines in the Soviet bloc to get this car. And when the Berlin Wall went down, it and the Yugo and their other cars vanished. Why? Because their best couldn't compete with our mediocre stuff. Why? Because not everybody has to be an expert for the free market to work its magic. You just need some people, a few car buffs, a few people who read car magazines, and through word of mouth, the good and bad news spread. The good companies thrive, the bad ones atrophy. Freedom, free markets will do a much better job. But people don't get it. And government, as it grows, can constantly point to examples of how they've saved us and they need to do more. As one example, let's look at OSHA. You know what that is? The Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It was created because some factories were dangerous. Workers were killed. The central planners said, this is unacceptable. We need to police this. We'll set rules, basic safety standards so workers don't get killed. And apparently they did well. Here's a chart that the head of OSHA under Clinton was fond of showing. It showed how workplace deaths dropped steadily since OSHA was created. Think of all the lives that government saved. Which seems great, except a researcher then went back and looked at the chart from before OSHA. For those of you, you can't see it there, can you? No. Anyway, the slope of the line is the same. Now, why would that be? Because in a free society, things get better. As we get smarter, as we get richer, we care more about safety. As we get smarter, we're cleverer about it. I mean, workers learn what kills people. They take steps to make sure it doesn't happen again. I mean, even the greedy companies take safety measures, if only because it costs them money to retrain the workers they injure or kill. Government's like someone who jumps in front of a parade and claims it leads the parade. But we keep giving them money. I mean, the war on poverty is another example of that. You know, Lyndon Johnson said we'll fix poverty, and they passed welfare, and poverty rate dropped for the 5 years after welfare. Great. But then, as you know, it stopped. And since then, it's gone up and down. Part of that is we taught people to be dependent on government, and then people stopped lifting themselves out of poverty. But what you may not know is what the line was doing before they created the war on poverty. The slope of that line was dropping even more sharply. People were already lifting themselves out of poverty. Government gummed it up. And they say they keep having to do more. And this is why government grows. Thomas Jefferson said it's the natural progress of things for government to grow and liberty to yield. And that's what's happened. Here's a chart of the growth of government. You may notice that for most of the history of the Republic, government was just a fraction of GDP. Now it's 40%. Here it is smoothed out in 10-year increments to get rid of the World War I and II bumps. We're on an unsustainable course, as you know. Bush and Obama doubled spending to the $3.8 trillion we have now. I mean, they take in $2 trillion. I think that would be enough. Then we wouldn't have a deficit. But no, they say they need $3.8 trillion. And then they promise they'll pay our Medicare benefits. And that, of course, is what's going to totally blow us up. Because we rudely, people my age, the baby boomers, we rudely insist on not dying. When FDR created Social Security, most people died before age 65, and then the numbers made sense, but they no longer do, yet nobody wants to cut anything. This isn't going to work. it just grows. So I try to explain this to people. That's my job in television, and I try to find ways to make it interesting, try to explain that government doesn't have the answers, that government can't. But it's an uphill battle because people want to believe that government can. I embarrass myself, I'm shallow, just to get their attention. How do you cover Obama's stimulus and cash for clunkers? Because it's intuitive to people. Let's give people $3,000 to junk an old car and buy a new one, and that'll stimulate the auto business. And what's good for the auto business is good for all of us. And stimulus will jumpstart the economy. But of course, as Bastiat taught us, that's the old broken window theory. It's like saying if a kid breaks a store window, he's creating jobs for a glassmaker, a janitor, and he is. But that's the seen benefit. The unseen harm is that the money that went to the glassmaker or the janitor now is not around to go to something else, to buy a shirt, to buy a meal. It's the assumption that you create wealth by destroying things that doesn't even make sense, and yet people believe it. So how do I illustrate that? So I embarrass myself by doing things like this.
Still have to make new ones and create jobs. Stimulate, stimulate.
So it's my goal to do those things, but you know, most of the subjects of what are bankrupting us, Social Security, Medicare, they don't lend themselves to that level of interest. I don't know how to do them on television. There's a guy here somewhere over there named Roger Nelson. He runs something, this group here puts out the Institute for Truth in Accounting. Happened to run into him today, walking around Chicago. They issue the financial state of the states, and the states are going broke. I mean, I knew about this a few years ago. Some guy named Eggers at Reason Magazine did a study on how all these state pension funds are going bankrupt. How would you do that on television? How would you tell people that in the media? Right, it's boring as hell. Can't imagine how you can do this. This is a horrible crisis. Illinois has 10, 15 billion in assets and 100 billion in unfunded liabilities. You're toast here. But it's not a good television story. And Roger, God bless you for pushing this. And in fact, I was amazed. I mean, the public, thanks to work of groups like Heartland, the public is coming around. This pension crisis story, I was amazed. Even the New York Times reports on it now. When you are persistent and you keep saying it, it does get across. I may not be able to do it on television, but it's counterintuitive. People want to think we're a rich country, old people deserve money, I paid in, I ought to get something back. Government can't. But the joy is, and we've gone this far and accomplished great things, because free people can, despite government, which is why the subtitle of my book is Why Government Fails, but individuals succeed. More on that later. But I try to express these ideas. I've sort of given up on people your age. I have a charity that takes my videos and offers them free to school teachers so they can at least introduce these ideas to high school students. Teachers used to write me and say, I taped your show and played it in my class, and we had a great discussion about free enterprise. Or, I wish I taped your show. How can I get it? And ABC wasn't selling them. So I started a charity that bought them from ABC and offers them free to teachers. And one of the reasons I was happy to leave from ABC to go to Fox was because I used to say I have to be at ABC because I'm reaching more people. We got 15 million at ABC, maybe 300,000 at Fox. Of course, now, years later, ABC only has, or 2020 has 5 million people. O'Reilly with his reruns also has 5 million. But my Stossel in the Classroom project gets 12 million high school kids a year. It's run by a woman named Andrea Rich, who some of you may know. She runs Laissez-Faire Books. But one of the more popular, the first videos with the high school kids they liked was one where I asked kids, why is America prosperous? I mean, most of the world isn't. Most of the world is miserably poor. 2 billion people live on $1 or $2 a day. 7 billion people on Earth, less than 1 billion have lives anywhere near ours. How come we did well? And the kids think for a long time they have no clue. And they say, it's because we're a democracy. And because we're a relatively new country, we have natural resources. And I say, well, India's a democracy. India has natural resources. India's poor. They say, well, they're overpopulated. But that's a myth. I tell them, well, the population density of India is the same as that of New Jersey, and New Jersey's doing okay. Well, depending on your perspective. And of course, the answer is economic freedom. Hong Kong, this is Milton Friedman's message, that Hong Kong has no natural resources, it's just a rock, and no democracy. It had the British rulers, then the Chinese communists, and yet they went from third to first world in 50 years. Why? Because they had economic freedom. The British rulers enforced rule of law. They kept people from killing each other or stealing from each other. They respected private property. And then they left people alone. They sat around and drank tea. And free people left alone made themselves prosperous. We know what works, but it's not intuitive. We work in the other direction. We keep making government bigger. But capitalism works. We've lifted billions this past 50 years out of the mud and misery of stoop labor and poverty. And yet capitalism is vilified in every newsroom I've been in. So why? Why do people hate business? They hate the banks. They hate chemical companies. These are the people who give us the stuff we need. They hate pharmaceutical companies who give us the drugs that keep us alive. Oh, they charge too much. Somebody came up to me in New York and said, "You John Stossel?" "Yes." "I hope you die soon." I'm trying to understand what this is about, and I think it's because I'm a consumer reporter who defends capitalism. So why do they hate capitalism so much? When at first I thought it was envy of the rich. And there's a discomfort in the disparity of income in America. I resent it that some of you are richer than me. I want some of your money. But then I thought about the kings and queens of old Europe. They were vastly richer than the average person. But they weren't hated. They were revered. And the people they hated were the bourgeoisie. They gave them that nasty name. They hated the people who sold them the stuff that made their lives better. Well, why is that? I think it's because people intuitively think of business as a zero-sum game. Politics is zero-sum. Somebody wins, somebody else loses. But business isn't, because business is voluntary. Only two ways to do things in life: force or voluntary. Government is force. And we need some force, rule of law. But most of life, the best of life, is voluntary. And you see that business is voluntary in the simple double thank you moment that you get in any simplest exchange. You buy a cup of coffee. You give her the buck, she gives you the coffee. You say, "Thank you, thank you." Why do you both say thank you? Because you wanted the coffee more than you wanted the buck. She wanted the buck more than she wanted the coffee. You both win, or it doesn't happen. So it's not like we're poorer because Bill Gates has $50 billion. Because business is voluntary, that means he got rich not because he took a big slice of the pie. He had to bake new pies. He had to give us something we wanted. To get rich in a free market means you're providing new wealth for people. But that's not intuitive. It's not perfect either. We'll have Enrons and Bernie Madoffs, but nothing is perfect. But they are the exception. Economic freedom creates prosperity. Economists focus on the prosperous part of that, but the freedom part is just as important. I object to big government not just because it makes us poorer. It's a moral objection. When government reduces our control over our own lives, it makes us less. It cuts the tendrils of civil society. It sucks the life out of people. That's why I say when they say, yes, we can, in the frenzy, and we can as individuals, but they meant it to mean government, I say, no, they can't. And they shouldn't try. My fantasy is that people will take this to state capitals. Maybe it can be a Heartland project. But since Joe says he's impressed by people who quote Hayek, I'll close by saying the curious task of economics, this is a Hayek point, is to teach men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. And what I've learned is that we should cheer up, because even though government can't, free people accomplish wonderful things. Individuals bring us all the good stuff. Clubs, charities, community groups bring us things like the Millennium Project out there. Families working toward common goals. And also greedy, profit-driven enterprises have brought us, Lipitor, robotic limbs, hip replacements, computers, iPhones, air conditioning. Even poor people now have access to food, music, travel, and lifespans that exceed what kings and queens had 100 years ago. We take these advances for granted. We take it for granted that you can go to a foreign country, stick a piece of plastic in the wall, and cash will come out. And that you can give that same piece of plastic to a total stranger and he'll rent you a car for a week. And when you get home, Visa or MasterCard will have the accounting correct to the penny. The government can't even count the votes accurately. But we're going to trust them to run health care? Yes, most people say, yes, they can. No, they can't. Thank you for fighting for the freedom that made America possible.